Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you're very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. A couple of videos back I made a fleeting reference to the fate of a particular Hugh Despenser, and there were a few requests for me to go into a bit more detail about him and his story. So that's what we're going to look at today. It's my belief that the fate of the Hugh Despenser of today's video is best understood by placing him and his story within a wider historical context. To massively oversimplify the tale of Hugh Despenser, it was his place as the favourite of the king that ultimately led to his total destruction. But he was not the first favourite of the reign. If we're going to grasp Hugh more completely, I think we need to start by looking at his predecessor in the king's affections. The king in question being King Edward II, the surviving son and thus heir of the indomitable King Edward I, who was known as Longshanks due to his height, and also his first wife, Eleanor of Castile. Their son, probably one of 14 children, was born on the 25th of April 1284 at Caernarvon, or in the building site that would become one of the ring of English castles that were established following Edward I's conquest of Wales. His son's birth at Caernarvon would allow Edward to present the nobility of Wales with a replacement for their dead prince, one who could claim to be Welsh-born. Edward of Caernarvon, as he was known before his accession to his father's throne, was renowned for being unconventional in his pursuits and affections. The Lanarkust Chronicle recounts Edward's enjoyment of rowing, cart driving, ditch digging and roof thatching, which were seen as being pastimes unbecoming of a person in his elevated position. However, Edward is also well known for having male favourites. Favourites who were the focus of a lot of animosity from the other nobles. One of these favourites was Hugh Despenser, who we'll get to in a moment, but before him there was Piers Gaveston. The pair met as young men. Piers served in Edward I's army in 1297 and 1300 and subsequently entered the household of Edward of Caernarvon. The Edwards were not always on the best of terms, and it is suggested that to punish his son, Edward I commanded that Piers be exiled in February 1307. Within months, on the 7th of July 1307, Edward I would be dead, and his 23-year-old son would ascend to the throne after him. Piers was swiftly summoned back to England, and was provided with an illustrious match of a bride. He married the new king's niece, the sister of the Earl of Gloucester, Margaret de Clare. This display of favour stoked opposition against him, and as royal favour earned him yet more advancements, the animosity would only grow. When the king travelled to marry his 12-year-old bride Isabella, daughter of King Philip IV of France and Joan of Navarre, he appointed Piers to be his regent. The newlyweds were back in England for their coronation on the 25th of February 1308, at which the king's favourite was permitted to take a position of extraordinary prominence. Piers would later be accused, probably erroneously, of receiving wedding gifts that had been intended for Edward and Isabella. But at the coronation, Piers carried St Edward the Confessor's crown into Westminster Abbey. Later in the ceremony, he fastened the ceremonial spur to Edward's left foot, and he also redeemed the sword from the altar. At the celebratory feast, Piers wore royal purple. He monopolised the king's attention, and there were tapestries bearing his arms decorating the walls of Westminster Hall. The king's new brothers-in-law, Charles and Louis, were apparently so insulted by Piers' behaviour and the respective insult to their sister that they left the festivities. It is frequently assumed that Piers and Edward's relationship was a sexual one. However, another interpretation of their relationship is that they had sworn a vow of brotherhood, which they seemingly took incredibly seriously. We aren't in the palaces with them, so we cannot know for sure what the precise character of their relationship was. But it was clearly deemed to be sufficiently out of bounds for the time, and also distracting from the business of kingship for Edward, that his wife's royal family was scandalised. Further to this, it was sufficient to drive almost all of Edward's nobles to arm themselves and demand Piers' exile from court and country. To avoid a civil war, which the king almost certainly would have lost, Edward gave in and banished his favourite. Piers was ordered to be gone by the 24th of June, 1308, 4 months after the coronation and celebration at which he had offended so many. The Archbishop of Canterbury announced that Piers would be excommunicated if he ever returned to England. Nevertheless, Piers was back in the first part of the following year, 1309, at Edward's command. He was as unpopular as ever, and his behaviour did even less to earn him allies. His presence in England was dangerous, both for himself and for his king. Baronial displeasure once again led Edward II to agree to demands. This time, he agreed to the election of a body of lords, spiritual and temporal, who would be empowered to reform the royal household and the nation. While the collection of new ordinances were being created and enforced between 1310 and 1311, Edward absented himself and his favourite by organising a military campaign against Scotland. If this campaign was intended to be a distraction from, or a defence against, the nobility's desire to send Piers away, it would not be successful. The new ordainers commanded him to go into perpetual exile from England and all English possessions. He was, once again, threatened with excommunication if he were not gone by the 1st of November 1311. Piers would, however, return just 2 months later, in January 1312. Edward announced his return to England and his holdings on the 18th of January. 2 months later, in the March, the Archbishop of Canterbury fulfilled his end of the threat and publicly excommunicated Piers. The barons also responded to his return by raising forces against him and against the king who supported him. On the 5th of April, Piers set up in Scarborough Castle. The king went to York. He was besieged there until the 19th of May 1312, when he agreed to a conditional surrender, which, among other things, would safeguard his person and life. The Earl of Pembroke and the barons Henry Percy and Robert Clifford were the besiegers that promised to protect Piers Gaveston and keep him alive. It was decided that he would travel south in the custody of the Earl of Pembroke. But on the 10th of June 1312, Piers was seized by the Earl of Warwick, who took him instead back to Warwick Castle. 9 days later, on the 19th of June 1312, following some, I would imagine, fairly tense discussions, Piers was taken out of Warwick Castle to Blacklow Hill. There, he was beheaded. Edward was, unsurprisingly, bereft, but nevertheless, he would have some cause for celebration within just a few months. His first child, with his then 17-year-old wife, was born on the 13th of November 1312. It was a boy, named Edward for his father, and who, with gestational length being what it is, must have been conceived months before the death of Piers. Whatever the relationship had been between the two men, it evidently did not distract either of them from creating children with their wives. Indeed, both before and after Piers' death, there is evidence to suggest that Queen Isabella also had the ear and respect of her husband. Gifts, grants and pardons were issued by him at her request. She was a successful diplomatic agent who supported her husband's foreign and domestic agendas. As the daughter and sister of French kings, she would always provide the potential for a smooth conduit for communication between these two frequently warring nations. She also took part in the various mediations between her husband and his fractious barons. The king and queen would have 3 more surviving children: John, born in 1316, Eleanor in 1318, and Joan in 1321. The marriage did have stressors, however. There were disputes over Aquitaine, which might have been expected to end following the marriage, but they continued between England and France. Additionally, Isabella would grow increasingly aware, as she grew up, that her husband's unorthodox pastimes and passions drew ridicule towards him, which, in turn, embarrassed her. Worse was to come. The soaring rise of the Despensers, a father and son duo who were both called Hugh and who can be differentiated as being either the elder or the younger, respectively. I'd argue that they were a worse prospect than Piers Gaveston, who I see as being little more than a vain, greedy peacock, whose presence by the king was distracting and infuriating. The Despensers had a dangerous capacity for spite and violence. Like Piers Gaveston, Despenser the Younger was joined to the rich and powerful de Clare family by his marriage to Eleanor de Clare in 1306. And later, nearly 6 years after the death of Piers Gaveston, so this time in 1318, Despenser the Younger was made chamberlain to the king. It was alleged that this power-hungry replacement favourite for the king used this appointment to control access to Edward. Apparently, he even blocked the Queen from seeing her own husband. While it might have been easy to underestimate her at first, by 1318, Isabella was no longer a 12-year-old girl fresh from France, but rather a woman in her 20s, a crowned queen, who was also the mother of the heir to the English throne. In addition to creating a virtual airlock of personal influence around Edward II, Despenser the Younger was greedy for land and wealth, as well as personal power and authority. Like his predecessor as favourite, Despenser the Younger also enraged the barons. He was blamed for his part in the king's embarrassing military failure at the siege of Berwick in September 1319. Then, the next year, Despenser the Younger overstepped the bounds with the Marcher lords in relation to the lordship of Gower. The king intervened, and he took Gower into his own hands in December 1320. The favourite got the blame for this too. On the 4th of May 1321, a collection of angry nobles, including those Marcher lords, marched on the land of the Despenser family, and they devastated them. These furious nobles went on. They took Newport 4 days later on the 8th of May, then Cardiff on the 9th, and Gower on the 13th. The king and his magnates met at Parliament in London in the August. Both Despensers were the focus of a number of accusations, including blocking access to the king and overstepping the boundaries of royal power. They were accused of deliberately appointing corrupt officials, and they were charged with embezzling from the Templars. Despenser the Younger was even charged with the murder of Llywelyn Bren, the nobleman who rebelled against Edward's rule in Wales, who was subsequently made the prisoner of Despenser the Younger, who, in turn, executed him without a trial. Eventually, Edward II was convinced of the necessity of agreeing to the permanent exile of both Despensers on the 14th of August, 1321. 6 days later, the king pardoned his barons for revolting against him. One of the people involved in convincing Edward to undertake this path to reconciliation with his nobles was his wife and queen, Isabella. And although this won her the respect and gratitude of the nobles, her husband Edward was apparently displeased with her for taking their side. Perhaps that is why she went along with a clearly orchestrated attempt to renew hostilities that occurred on the 13th of October 1321 at Leeds Castle. Isabella was refused entry to the castle by a nervous Margaret de Clare, who was the wife of the temporarily absent keeper of the fortification. In response, the castle was besieged and ultimately fell to the king within weeks, on the 31st of October. Then, the defeated garrison troop and their commander were executed. On the 8th of December, Edward recalled the Despensers, and for the next 4 years, between 1322 and 1326, father and son enjoyed an ascendancy at court. The king was essentially theirs to command. Through their favour with him and their capacity to manipulate the legal system, they preyed on the rich but weak for their own profit. Despenser the Younger would eventually amass lands that were valued at £7,000 at the very least. They also, I believe, looked to settle some old scores. They used the backdrop of increasing Anglo-French hostilities, which had started to ramp up in October 1323, after English officials destroyed the newly erected French bastide at St. Sardos in the Agenais. What followed has become known as the War of St. Sardos. During this period, Edward's overseas conflict was coupled with strife at the heart of his domestic setup. It appears that Edward's trust in his wife had reached an all-time low. This may have been because she backed the barons against Edward and the Despensers back in 1321. But it also seems that upon the Despensers' return, they were more than happy to poison the marital well further. Isabella would eventually be cast as almost an enemy agent, acting for the land of her birth. In September 1324, the king's unpopular advisers convinced him of the sense of taking her English lands under his control, which then left her fully dependent on him for the funds to support herself and her household. Those she trusted to surround her were subsequently dismissed. Eleanor de Clare, who was Edward's niece and Despenser the Younger's wife, was then tasked apparently with spying on her queen. It is even alleged that she looked over all of the letters that were sent by the queen. However, within a matter of months, Isabella would go from being treated as an enemy alien to being viewed once again as a useful diplomatic pawn. The English crown hoped to put an end to the conflict with France, which had been ruled by Isabella's youngest surviving brother, Charles IV, since 1322. Thus, the English queen was sent away to negotiate. She left in March 1325. She secured a peace settlement. However, as King Edward II of England was also Duke of Aquitaine and Count of Poitou, His brother-in-law, the French king, was his liege lord, to whom he owed homage, to be paid in person. But as Edward's England was still teetering on the edge of all-out rebellion, the king probably wasn't overjoyed at the thought of taking a little overseas jolly for this extended ceremonial family reunion. Luckily for the king, he had a son and heir who could attend in his place. At nearly 13 years old, Edward, Earl of Windsor, was sent to join his mother and uncle on the 12th of September, 1325. Towards the end of that month, perhaps wondering just how long paying ceremonial homage could possibly take, Edward commanded his wife and son to return to England. Why would she obey? Why would she return to a court, country and king that had treated her so poorly and whose distrust of her might even prove dangerous to her life? Isabella held the heir to England. She had the support of her royal brother, and now she also had access to the nobles exiled by her husband's regime. At some point, one of them, Roger Mortimer, even became her lover. Isabella was positioning herself in outright opposition to her husband. At the start of 1326, she travelled to Hainault to betroth her son to the Count of Hainault's daughter, Philippa. Her future daughter-in-law came with a dowry that Isabella used to finance a mercenary force. This was an invasion force that landed in England on the 24th September 1326. Success would be swift, as support for regime change was apparently readily available. London came out against Edward II on the 15th of October, and 11 days later, on the 26th of October, Isabella's position was secure enough for her to proclaim her son to be the guardian of the realm. On the same day, Bristol submitted to her, and Hugh Despenser the Elder was captured. He was swiftly executed. The younger Despenser was with Edward II when they were captured on the 16th of November. Hugh the Younger's fate was designed to be both agonising and shameful. Geoffrey Hamilton describes how Despenser was taken to Hereford. Outside the city, he was stripped and then reclothed with his arms reversed. That's referring to an achievement of arms. And he was crowned with stinging nettles. Condemned to death as a traitor, on the 24th of November 1326, he was drawn on a hurdle to the gallows and then hanged from a height of 50 feet. Still alive, he was cut down and eviscerated before finally being beheaded. His head was displayed on London Bridge. His quarters were sent to Bristol, Dover, York, and Newcastle. Less than a year later, Edward II, who would be deposed in favour of his son, would also be dead, in circumstances that are still the stuff of rumour and scandal. His queen Isabella's legacy includes being remembered by history as the she-wolf of France. But the respective fates and legacies of Edward II and Isabella are stories for another day, and perhaps for another video. But what do you think of these tales of King Edward II's favourites? Do you think the nobility's experience with Piers Gaveston made the Despensers' position more difficult? Could the Despensers have learnt something from the fate of Gaveston? Did they simply choose to ignore the lessons? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comments section underneath this video, or you can find me on social media. I'll leave links to the other places you can find me on the internet in my description box. Follow me over on some or all of them so we can continue this conversation and start some others. I do hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, why not share it with your friends? Please also let me know by hitting the thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel, and if you think you are subscribed, just have a little check now. Make sure that YouTube hasn't mysteriously unsubscribed you. While you're there, checking, subscribing, maybe resubscribing, why not hit the bell icon beside the subscribe button so that YouTube tells you when I've next uploaded. I hope you're going to have a great day, whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.